The conversation about the deficit, budget cuts, and the president's speech yesterday. Terry Keeley is the founder and senior managing principal of Sovereign Trends, where he advises foreign governments, central banks, and sovereign wealth funds. Terry previously worked for UBS, and before that, in the 1980s, for David Stockman, the Michigan congressman who became President Reagan's budget chief, and also for Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. Terry is a contributor here at Bloomberg Television. Terry, you've been on the phone this morning to people down in D.C., both Republicans and Democrats. We know more or less where the Democrats stand. We know where the Republicans stand. Why are the Republicans so angry today?
I think, Eric, it's absolutely clear that the president certainly mischaracterized a large portion of the path to prosperity, the Ryan plan. For example, suggesting that we're abandoning our seniors, when in fact all the changes that the Path to Prosperity proposes are not for the current generation of retirees. It's for your children, it's for your daughters, and for my sons. And that type of moralizing was just an inappropriate conversation to have at this.
But that's politics. Come on, that's politics.
Is this the time for politics, Eric?
Apparently it is the time for politics. Look, there's been politics on both sides. I'm not saying it should be, but it clearly is. And maybe Paul Ryan thinks that he's above the fray, but there are other Republicans who don't, and we don't need to get into a conversation about that. But as far as Medicare goes,
yes,
I know you have read the CBO analysis, yes, right? The CBO analysis makes it fairly clear, I'm talking about Paul Ryan's plan, that there is a trade-off here, right? That people are going to have to bear higher costs for Medicare on themselves. This is what the CBO says. Correct. I'm not saying what Paul Ryan says. Yes. This is a nonpartisan analysis, right? Yes. People are going to have to bear a higher personal share of the cost for Medicare, and the states are going to have to bear a higher share of Medicare expenses. Yes. Now, there are going to be transfer payments, but the trade-off seems to be that's what you get on the one hand, and what are you trading off for? Lower taxes.
I think many of us hoped yesterday, Eric, we would see the president have a Clinton-esque moment, that the era of big government was going to be over, and that we would see the president endorse the Rivlin-Ryan proposal for block grants for some of the problems that are arising in our entitlement programs. After all, that's how we solved the welfare problem as we know it, through block grants. The idea, the problem that came clearly into focus to me after listening to the president yesterday is that the vision that he has for America and the vision that, and everyone's patriotic on both sides, let's stop questioning people's patriotism, but the visions are so broadly different that unfortunately we're going to have to wait till 2012 until they're actually resolved.
Okay, but
so
that's
many
because
of these tough decisions are being pushed off.
It seems as though, and again, I don't want to put the onus on the Republican Party because it takes two in this system to tango. It seems that the line in the sand is over taxes. The president says we need to raise some tax revenue, and John Boehner and Orrin Hatch say no way, and they're not the only ones.
You can say it's over taxes.
And he has some support from Republicans. Your former employer, David Stockman, is among those who says we have to raise taxes. The Bowles-Simpson Commission, another bipartisan effort, said we need to raise $1 trillion in taxes. Yes. The president says we need to raise $1 trillion in taxes.
The president says we need to raise $1 trillion in taxes on only people who pay $250,000, who make $250,000 or more. That takes out 96% of taxpayers. As you very well know, Eric, the bottom 50% pay no taxes at all. All of these discussions.
How many people are we talking about?
We're talking about 50% of the population.
No. Who earn more than $250,000?
4 or 5% of the population. The top 5% of the population pays 60% of the tax revenues.
We're talking about 3% of the population.
Correct. We're talking about 3.
Okay, so 4 million people.
Correct.
So we're going to fight over whether 4 million people have to pay more taxes?
No.
Shouldn't the fight be about 325 million people?
We're going to fight over whether or not it's possible to have the policies that we have on the books, even if we tax every single penny that every person makes above $250,000. Not possible, Eric. The issues are not just taxes. They're intractable in many ways.
You know what? We have to continue the conversation. Terry, as I mentioned when we introduced you, you advise central banks, you advise foreign governments, you advise sovereign wealth funds. They're the ones looking at this situation and trying to make a decision about whether or not to continue financing the U.S. deficit. At the end of the day, is that all that matters?
Well, no. What matters at the end of the day is confidence in the full faith and credit of the United States and the fact that they can have, ultimately, their fiscal house in order. Eric, I'm just back from Beijing, and I have to tell you, I've got to give a report this week that's different from the one that I gave last week, which is that the likelihood of the U.S. federal government politicians from both sides of the aisle coming together on a grand bargain is receding.
You thought this was likely, and you told as much to the Chinese last week.
$4 trillion seems doable amongst reasonable men and women, but we now have so many lines in the sand that Washington, D.C. looks like a Burberry scarf. We have no ability to come to very fundamental agreements on how the major drivers of the debt, notably health care. If health care is off the table, we have a problem.
So what breaks the logjam?
Much higher rates. At this stage, the likelihood of there being a crisis of confidence in the U.S. federal government spilling over into debt and currency markets has grown exponentially.
So it's the same situation as we saw play out in Portugal, for example. Borrowing costs just keep going and going and going until the government realizes it literally has no option but the nuclear option.
The hope has long been that we will be able to control our situation, that nothing will be forced upon us by the markets. That receded yesterday, Eric. The prospects for a breakdown in confidence in the U.S. federal government are growing.
It's pretty stern stuff.
It is pretty stern stuff.
Terry, thank you for joining us and adding some perspective to this debate. That was Terry Keeley. He is the founder and senior managing principal at Sovereign Trends, formerly with UBS and also formerly with David Stockman, Ronald Reagan's budget director.